Well, would you turn with me again in your Bibles to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, as we continue our study. For those of you who've been with us, we've been looking at Mark for quite some time now, starting from the beginning. Chapter 1, since last fall, last September, and now we're all the way approaching the end of chapter 7. 16 chapters long, Mark's Gospel, and we're about halfway there. And this morning, I've titled the message, An Unlikely Encounter with Unlikely Faith. Jesus meets a Gentile woman. And we're going to be looking at verses 24 through 30. So follow along with me as I read from verse 24 through 30. And from there, speaking of Jesus, he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first. For it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Social distancing has become a term that we're all too familiar with in this current time. Right? Whenever we go out in public, running an essential errand, or if you're in an essential function or job or service, you maintain 6 feet distance from you and everyone else around you for your own safety and for their safety, so that you and they contribute to not spreading and contracting this virus. And social distancing is nothing new. It's something that's been practiced throughout every major pandemic. 100 years ago, during the Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919, when 50 million people were killed worldwide. It was even practiced during the outbreak of the worst pandemic, the worst plague, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, which between 1337 and 1343 killed 200 million people. And social distancing actually goes all the way back to Jesus' day with the Jews, albeit in a slightly different kind of way. Yes, they practiced social distancing physically, as far as keeping a physical distance between them and the non-Jews, the pagans, the Gentiles, those not chosen by God. But more than anything, it was a literal social distance between them and everyone else, because they were inside God's covenant community. They were his chosen people. They had the covenants and the promises and the blessings and the law. And everyone else was on the outside. They were not chosen. They were nobodies. They were far from God. They were unclean. They were outsiders, pagans. And the Jews actually thought they were socially and spiritually better than everyone else, because God had chosen them. The problem is, as we saw in the past couple weeks in the first half of chapter 7, they were wrong. See, they thought they were better than everyone else because God had given them his law and chosen them, but they had taken that and went way beyond the law of God and started adding to and following their own oral traditions, ceremonies and rituals, and all these external observances about what to eat and what not to eat, and what to wear and what not to wear. And they thought this was what separated them from the pack. This is what made them right with God. This is what God expected of them. And they were wrong. And Jesus tells them they were wrong. He calls them out on their false, hypocritical religion and worship. He tells them that their hearts are far from God. But you see, even more than just confronting them in their false religion, in their hypocrisy, Jesus does something else in that first half of chapter 7. See, in pronouncing all food clean, and in telling them that it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth, because what comes out of the mouth comes from the heart, he pronounced everyone unclean, and he leveled the playing field between Jew and non-Jew, Jew and Gentile. He's saying all of us have unclean hearts. And it's from the heart that defiles, because all of us have evil thoughts, and these evil thoughts are about immorality, adultery, conceit, envy, jealousy, slander, lies, theft. And all of us are on the same playing field. We need something more. We need something different. We need grace. We need faith. We need a way to be reconciled and to be made right with God. Jews and Gentiles. And that's exactly what Jesus says. And we see a picture of what we need, namely saving faith, because of the work that Christ did for us on the cross. We see an example of this, a picture of this morning with the Syrophoenician woman and her great faith. We see that this woman was persistent, she was reverent, and she was humble. And it's a picture of great faith, the kind of faith that we all need to aspire to, anyone who would ever believe. It's the kind of faith that saves, and the kind of faith that you and me and everyone is called to. And so look with me as we pick it up in verse 24. So and from there, he, Jesus, arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. So a quick recap by way of summary. Jesus was previously in probably Capernaum in Galilee. The religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, again made the trek all the way up from Jerusalem, about 80 miles south, to go north to Capernaum to inspect Jesus, to follow him in his ministry and verify some of the reports that were swirling around. They see his disciples not washing their hands before they eat, and they question him, Jesus, why aren't your disciples not washing their hands before they eat, according to the tradition of our elders, the oral tradition? And Jesus blasts them. You're hypocrites. You're missing the whole point. This is false worship. It's all external. You're doing it for the wrong reasons. Your hearts are far from me. You don't see that it's not what goes into the mouth that makes you unclean, but what comes out of the mouth. And so he teaches them the proper understanding of purity in the eyes of God. It's about the heart. It's about having a changed and transformed heart, not external observances. He teaches the disciples privately, explains the parable to them. And so in talking about ritual purity, clean versus unclean, he sets the stage for this next phase in Jesus' ministry. This next phase now, where he continues north, beyond the borders of Galilee, which is to say Israel, northwest, to a Gentile territory of unclean people in Tyre and Sidon. Maybe depending on the translation you have in your hands, it might not say and Sidon. That's fine. It really depends. I'm reading from the ESV, and this one favors the two earliest witnesses, the two earliest manuscripts that have and Sidon in it, but there isn't much early attestation of that, so a lot of English translations have left that out. So if you're reading the NIV, the NLT, the NASB, or whatever you have in your hands and it's not there, don't worry. It's not a big deal. Both cities were in that region, that general region of Phoenicia, both prominent cities, very prominent cities. In fact, in the ancient Near Eastern society, several hundred years before Jesus' day, these were the two most prominent cities in Phoenicia. The two most prominent city-states of wealth, political power, political might, until Alexander the Great came and he conquered Sidon in 333 BC, and he completely devastated and destroyed Tyre in 332 BC. And so from then on, it became part of the Greek world, the Greek-speaking world. And a few hundred years later, all the way in Jesus' day, now it's part of the Roman Empire. And in that part of the Roman Empire, it was still predominantly Greek-speaking. It was the tongue of the day. So now, Mark says Jesus is in the region of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre was about 35 miles northwest of Galilee, along the Mediterranean Sea in that Phoenician region, which today is modern-day Lebanon. He doesn't say Jesus was specifically in Tyre, in the city, or Sidon. He was just in the general area. He was in and around there, and the border was kind of blurred between Galilee and Phoenicia and Tyre there. There wasn't really a solid, firm border, several miles of kind of neutral territory, if you will. Why did Jesus go here, or how far into Gentile territory did he traverse? Mark doesn't tell us. Was he trying to get away from some of the religious leaders who were pestering him and bothering him and detracting from his ministry, as we've been seeing more and more, and as we just saw at the beginning of chapter 7? Maybe. Was he fleeing Herod, who we also saw killed John the Baptist, had him beheaded, and is now hearing reports about this miracle worker and is suspecting that it's John the Baptist raised from the dead? Was he trying to evade some of the unnecessary chatter and unnecessarily early ministry hindrance from the religious leaders of Israel? Maybe. Or maybe he was just trying to get away with the disciples, seeking a little bit of respite finally so he could sit in private and teach them. Could have been any of these three. Regardless of the exact reason why, we know he went. But Mark tells us that he didn't go there for public ministry, did he? Because he says he didn't want anyone to know he was there. He privately and stealthily and secretly entered a home to evade the public sphere. He wanted to keep a low profile. But as we've also been seeing from almost the beginning of his ministry, his reputation precedes him. And the people catch wind of who he is, and word spreads of this authoritative teacher and powerful miracle worker, and he can't keep a low profile for long. It says he could not stay hidden. In verses 25 and 26. But immediately, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. So Jesus' attempt at privacy and secrecy is again thwarted. Immediately, he says, this woman recognizes him. She sees him from afar. She knows who he is, and she comes running at his feet, falling at his feet. What, was she running so fast that she merely tripped and fell at his feet? No. Mark says she came because she had a problem. She had a major problem. She had a demon-possessed daughter who had an unclean spirit, and she comes bowing before his feet in worship, begging him to help her. She comes saying, "Lord, Lord, Son of David," according to Matthew's account. Why is this Gentile, Greek-speaking, Syrophoenician, Canaanite, Matthew actually says, begging for mercy from Jesus? Do you remember how vile and wicked the Canaanites were? So much so that when God was finally going to give the promised land, Canaan, to Israel, and Joshua was conquering them, he commanded them to wipe them all out. They were vile. They were wicked. They were idol-worshiping pagans who sacrificed children even to their gods, to their deities, to Baal. Do you remember Jezebel, who married King Ahab in the northern kingdom? She was from Sidon. She was a Sidonian princess. And she's the one who directly led to the widespread, rampant idolatry and worship of Baal in Israel, right? And the judgment that God brought on them afterwards. And on her for being the culprit. She was eaten by dogs. Why would this woman come to Jesus? This woman who, by Jesus' day, fast forwarding from all of the idolatry and the paganism and the Canaanites and Tyre and Sidon, in that day come to Jesus. Knowing that even then, the two countries, if you will, or peoples were at peace. They had political peace treaties, trade treaties, but they were still sworn enemies. And in fact, Josephus, the great Jewish historian, says that this Tyre were the greatest enemies to Israel in that day. They were their sworn enemies, and they resented them bitterly. They were hostile towards each other. They didn't want anything to do with each other. This Syro-Phoenician Gentile woman, that's from Syrian Phoenicia, not Libyan Phoenicia, which was in North Africa. Mark just probably specifies that, so we know exactly who she is and where she's from. She's from Syrian Phoenicia. And she comes to Jesus. She comes to her sworn enemy with this kind of respect and reverence. Why would she do that? Why would she come to Jesus at all? A Jew, an Israelite. Because she's desperate as a mother. She has a mother's desperation. A mother who's so desperate because her daughter has an unclean spirit, a demon, and she needs help. A mother who knows and fears the worst is about to happen to her child, that her daughter's on the brink of death and can't stand the thought of losing her child, so she'll do anything. Even go to her worst enemy, so to speak. I know a lot of us can't understand the prospect of death or losing a child or how terrible that would be. I know recently, last week, a friend of mine went to seminary with his wife. They went in for an ultrasound, and they realized the baby didn't have a heartbeat for 3.5 weeks. Their baby son was gone, and they didn't even know it. And so they induced her, and she gave birth to a stillborn. Or good friends of mine whose mother that they're related to, their son has been battling cancer, colon cancer, for years. It's been getting worse and worse, off and on, in remission back. And recently he started feeling even worse in his lungs, so they admitted him to the hospital, checked him, and fearing the worst, that maybe he even contracted this virus. And we all know those who have underlying health conditions, not the least of which is weak immune systems, such as those who are cancer patients and undergoing chemo and radiation, are more at risk from this. So they run the tests. They confirm, sure enough, he does have a throat, a lung infection, a breathing problem. And a few days later, he's gone. And it doesn't matter whether it's a newborn baby. It doesn't matter whether it's your 10-year-old daughter. It doesn't matter whether it's a 30-year-old. The prospect of losing your child is a parent's greatest fear. And that's what drives this woman to Jesus. You say, well, why didn't she go to her own gods? her own idols, her own Baals. She did. You can bet she did. She probably prayed to those wooden statues and to those stone idols all night long. And they stayed silent. Because wooden and stone idols can't speak. Pieces of wood and stone can't hear. And they certainly have no power to do anything. And she's desperate, at her wit's end. No other hope. Nothing left. But evidently she's heard stories about this Jesus of Nazareth, this powerful preaching, miracle-working prophet from Nazareth, this Jew. Maybe she had hoped that she would ever run into him. Probably never thought that she would. And we're not told how exactly or why, but evidently she recognizes him, that he's here. He's in her area. And she runs to him. She runs to him, crying out for help. In Matthew's account, he keeps saying she was crying out after him, "Lord, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me and my demon-possessed daughter." And Matthew actually adds another detail that Mark doesn't. He says his disciples were getting so annoyed by her incessant crying out to Jesus, she said, "This woman will not stop crying out. Send her away. Get her out of here." They had enough of her. But she was persistent. She doesn't stop. She won't stop until Jesus hears her. She won't stop until Jesus does for her what she needs and what she asks. And how does Jesus respond to her finally? Verse 27. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Wow. Jesus. First, you repeatedly ignore her crying out to you. And now you use a parable where you essentially call her a dog? This woman who comes to you begging for mercy, reverently falling before you in worship, calling you Lord, knowing you're the Son of David, on behalf of her demon-possessed daughter? And you're going to call her a dog? I thought you only had those kinds of choice words and harsh language reserved for those self-righteous, those who thought they were in right standing with God and good, like the religious leaders of Israel, the scribes and the Pharisees. I thought you were always compassionate and gentle and kind and tender to all those who come to you begging for mercy, humbly. What's going on, Jesus? Well, you're right. He is always compassionate and gentle and kind and merciful to those who come to him humbly asking for mercy. I think there's something else going on here. I think Jesus is purposely using provocative language to test the genuineness of her faith and to set her up as the example, the model of faith for his disciples who are dull in understanding, weak in faith, hard of hearing, blind, and who desperately need to know what great faith looks like because they haven't got a clue. Okay, so she's the dog in this parable. Okay, who are the children? That's Israel. In the Old Testament and throughout Judaism, Israel were often identified as the children of God, right? His covenant people. They're the children of God. And dogs are those outside. They came to refer to Gentiles as dogs, actually. which is a grave insult, usually reserved only for the likes of false teachers, false prophets. They came to refer to Gentiles as dogs. They didn't like dogs in Judaism. They were scavengers. They were detestable. They were trash, garbage, dump eating, wild, uncivilized, dirty, filthy creatures. It doesn't matter if Jesus, even in his analogy here, uses the less harsh, the kind of smaller, diminutive term for a dog, rather than the other word that they would use for a beast, a mongrel, a street dog, a scavenging dog that's running around eating trash and garbage and dead corpses. Yeah, he softens it a little bit by using the term that they reserve for little domesticated pet lap dogs that would sit under the table. Sure. But nevertheless, he's calling her a dog. I think that's harsh enough. I don't think that would be easy to receive. So what exactly is Jesus trying to say in this parable? He's saying that his mission is first. And the operative word there in verse 27 is first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. This was the model of ministry that he had throughout his time on earth, wasn't it? And it was the same model of ministry that the apostles after him followed. Paul says the same thing in Romans. We preach first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. Because the Jews were God's old covenant chosen people, the elect. They had the covenants, they had the promises, they had the blessings, they had the law. And Jesus came to them first. And he strategically uses that word for that smaller lap household pet dog. And the woman picks up on it. The woman picks up on it. And if you look at her response, she is the first person in Jesus' entire ministry, in the Gospel of Mark, in all the Gospels, to go toe-to-toe with Jesus. Look at verse 28. But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Yes, Lord, I understand that the children need to eat first. I would never ask to take their plate from them. I would never ask for a seat at the table. I know I don't belong at the table. I don't have a seat at the table. I'm not the chosen, elect, Old Testament community people. Yet even when the children are eating, even as they're eating, the crumbs are falling from their plate and from the table on the floor. And even the dogs are able to lick them up. Wow. For the first time in Jesus' entire ministry, we have someone who actually understands the meaning of one of his parables without him even explaining it. She gets it. And not only that, she cleverly and wittily responds using Jesus' own parable against him. She gets it. And his disciples don't even get it. What a shocker this is. A woman gets it, and worse, a Gentile woman. These were the two worst badges you could carry in that ancient Near Eastern society to the Jews, and especially to the Jewish leaders. So you can imagine the amazement, the disciples sitting here watching this. What a shock this is to them. Probably looking at one another, jaws dropped open. What is going on here? How was this woman even permitting herself to speak to a rabbi, this Gentile unclean woman, and where in the world does she get this wisdom from? And they're not the only ones that are amazed. Look at Jesus' response in verse 29. And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed, and the demon was gone. And Mark actually significantly de-emphasizes Jesus' words here. If you turn to Matthew's account in chapter 15, he says, "O woman, great is your faith." I haven't seen anything like it. It's not just acceptable, satisfactory, or good. It's great. I've been throughout all of Galilee and Jerusalem for 2.5 years, and I haven't seen faith like this. Great is your faith. And it's true, isn't it? We've been going through the Gospel of Mark. Do you recall him ever saying anything like this to anyone? Even the woman with the 12-year bleeding in chapter 5. She has faith. He says, your faith has made you well. But he doesn't say it was great faith. He doesn't even say it was good faith. It was actually merely satisfactory faith because it was kind of a mystical, magical faith attached to the healing powers of his robe. But nevertheless, this woman has great faith. And especially contrast that with his disciples, the insiders, the chosen, the ones who've been receiving the private parable explanations, who in chapter 6:52, Mark says, still didn't understand about the loaves and the fish because their hearts were hardened. Who in chapter 7 didn't understand the clean and the unclean and what really makes someone clean and unclean. And Jesus has to explain it to them. He says, are you still so dull in your understanding? Who in a couple weeks we're going to see in chapter 8, Jesus says, you have ears, but you're not hearing. You have eyes, but you're not seeing me. Are you still so dull? Are your hearts still so hardened? Do you still not understand who I am and what my purpose is? It's the same language he uses to indict outsiders, those who can't hear, those who can't see. They're faithless. And this Gentile, pagan woman has great faith. And now we know why Jesus intended to respond to her this way, seemingly so harshly in the beginning all along. Because in his omniscience, he knew how she would respond. And he knew that his disciples needed to see what real, genuine, great faith looks like. Great faith is persistent. Great faith is reverent. And great faith is humble. And they needed to know that it would come in the least likely forms from women, from Gentile women, from those who in their minds were the most socially distant from them in the class structures, and those that were the furthest from God. They needed that lesson. They needed to know that Jesus' kingdom program included everyone, including the lowliest and most insignificant in their society, women and Gentiles. And he says this woman has great faith. And her faith proved to be great, didn't she? Because she persisted. She persisted after Jesus. She came to him. She was relentless. She was persisting. She was crying out to him until he finally responded. She fell at his feet and begged him and wouldn't leave, wouldn't let go until she got from him what she needed. And what about you? Do you persist after God in prayer to give you what you need? Do you come to him humbly in prayer, persisting day and night until he gives you what you desperately need, whatever it is you need? He doesn't promise to answer all of your prayers, no. Certainly not the ones that are not according to his will for your life. But he does promise to answer the prayers that are according to his will for your life. He promises to answer the prayers that are asking for grace, for mercy, for peace, for ease, for faith, for patience, for perseverance, And yes, even those prayers for physical needs, for financial needs, he often answers those too, and he does so often just in the nick of time when you least expect it, in the way you least expect it. But you got to persist. You've got to ask always and often. And Jesus says this woman's faith is great because it's reverent. She knew exactly who Jesus was. She addresses him as Lord, the Son of David, his kingly messianic title. And she falls down before him in worship, which is the only acceptable response and way to approach God, the sovereign, omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing God, creator, sustainer, and sovereign of the world. When you come to God, do you recognize him? Do you revere him as the sovereign, sustainer, creator, Lord of your life? The one who has all power, including the power to answer your prayers and to give you what you need? Do you acknowledge him as the sovereign God of all comforts and all mercy, who alone has the power to dispense that mercy and grace in desperate times of need? Because that's the posture of great faith. You have to go to him and believe he's the one who rewards those who do his good bidding and deeds, those who follow him, those who obey him. You have to believe he's the one who has that power. That's what it means to come before him in total dependence and in total submission. He's God. He can and he will give to you what you need. Jesus says this woman's faith was great because it's humble. And her humility is shown not only in her bowing down before Jesus, yes, but even in her response to Jesus. Did you notice? He calls her a dog. Forget if it's a little household pet dog. That's an insult. And she doesn't get angry. She doesn't get puffed up with pride. Her ego doesn't get in the way. She doesn't scoff and turn away and run away from him and stop persisting, say, forget about it, I don't need you. I don't need your help anymore. No. She humbly accepts her part in this analogy as the lowly, undeserving dog who doesn't have a seat at the table because she desperately needs a seat at the table. And she desperately needs the mercy that the Lord and Son of David alone can provide. So she humbly accepts the analogy of a dog and doggedly pursues Jesus until he gives her what she wants. And that is what often causes us not to go to God, especially in our times of greatest need, isn't it? It's pride, our ego, self, and an overinflated view of self. I don't need to go to God. I don't need prayer. I got this. I'm fine on my own. I can get through this relying on my own cleverness, on my own resources, on my own energies. My, I. Who are you to talk to me like this? Who are you to call me a dog? And we don't get over that. It was pride that changed Satan from an angel to a devil. It was pride that changed angels to demons. And pride is Satan's greatest ploy, his greatest device that he uses to prevent God's people from going to him and depending upon him. Because I got this. It's about me. relying on myself. It's funny. Pride is the only thing that God cannot work with. And it's not that he can't work with it. He won't work with it. He willfully chooses not to work with and to respond to prideful people. Because it's against everything he stands for and everything he looks for in us. You know, Jesus sent no one away empty except those that were already full of themselves. There's one other thing I don't want you to miss here in Jesus' encounter with this woman. So Jesus fed the hungry crowds in chapter 6, right, when he fed the 5,000 men plus their women and their children. They were following him all day. They were listening to his teaching. It was getting late. He had compassion and mercy on them. He felt bad for them, and he fed them with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Those were his people. These were Galileans, Jews. And he gave them bread. And now, this woman, who was outside of God's covenant people, a Gentile, a pagan, a dog, he gives bread to. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to see in chapter 8, there's another massive crowd that builds about him. And he has compassion on them and mercy on them. 4,000 people. And he gives them bread. And they're Gentiles, pagans, those outside the covenant promises of God in the Old Testament. Because Jesus gives his bread to the Gentiles. It was his purpose and his plan all along. Jesus and his kingdom program was meant to break down all barriers, ethnically, nationally, religiously, socially, politically, you name it, all gone. That dividing wall that separated everyone from God is gone in Jesus. Everyone's welcome into his kingdom. Everyone that comes by faith, that is. You see, you have to have faith. You have to believe that Jesus is the bread of life, the bread that comes down from heaven, and the bread that if you taste will never leave you hungry or thirsty again. But you have to believe. You have to come. You don't even have to have great faith like the Syrophoenician woman, but you got to have faith. You got to have a little faith. You got to give him something to work with. And if you come to him in faith and believe and trust in him, he'll take care of the rest. That's his promise. Bow with me.